start off by saying that Angela was kind enough to do this for us, but also was risky enough to do this without having any pre-meetings. And so,
Nope. And Mark, you were like, anything you want me to, anything I can. I'm like, no, it's all good.
yeah, so here we go. You ready?
Yeah. Yes, I'm ready.
All right. So, everyone, welcome. This is Angela Duckworth, and I've known Angela, I don't know, maybe a decade now. Back and forth with different, our paths cross in many different ways, from work in social and emotional learning and personality development. So my first question, Angela, for you is, who are you?
I am from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, exit 4, off the turnpike, near the big white water tower that says Cherry Hill. And I was a teacher for some years in New York City and San Francisco public schools. And then I am now a professor of psychology, and I study effort. I study the psychology of motivation and effort.
Okay. I'm from Jersey too.
What? Did not know that. Where? South Jersey, North Jersey?
No, I'm from North Jersey, but I'm from Clifton.
Oh, yeah. See, that's
it's next, like you,
part of New Jersey.
Yeah, I'm next to Montclair, which was like the poshy town.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Okay, maybe. Well, yeah, all of North Jersey was posh to those of us who lived in South Jersey.
It looks like we've got a lot of Jersey people here right now. Go to Jersey. We'll go for coffee afterwards.
Yeah, for coffee. Some good pizza.
Perfect. So, I've been asking people as we've begun these conversations, just, the question that, that I ask all the time because you've read my book and have been kind enough to blurb it.
I was going to say right there, but I moved. It was like, it's right here, but it's in a box.
So, how are you feeling? How have you been feeling?
I stole that from you, so now I'm asking people, how are you feeling and not how are you? Well, I just moved a few days ago into a new house, so I'm feeling actually a little agitated, like a little irritable, and very caffeinated.
Okay. And is that how you want to feel?
No. I don't think I really want to feel this way for very long.
All right. So then my big question for you is, what's your strategy? So when you're feeling irritable, when you're feeling overwhelmed like most of our nation is right now, what are your go-to emotion management strategies?
I have. First of all, Mark, I don't know my greatest weakness, I guess I would say, is emotion regulation. Like, by far. So, I'll give you a sense of the strategies I'm working on, but I am really learning. One is I am trying to breathe, and I have this habit that I've had since I really literally can't remember, but much of my adulthood, where I just to breathe, and I'm not recommending this, especially not to kids, but I do this, like I'm smoking, but I'm not smoking. Mm-hmm. I've never smoked a cigarette, but it's just to breathe. Probably I should learn how to breathe without pretending to smoke a fake cigarette. But anyway, that's one of my strategies when I'm really stressed. Like, you'll just see me. You're like, what?
I think that might be. I actually sometimes do that. I just pretend, and I like.
Yeah, because it makes you.
It also makes me feel like I'm like a movie star from the 1940s.
A little from Mad Men. Maybe I started doing this well before Mad Men. I'm like, where did I get that? Like, anyway, but yes, I try to breathe. And my second strategy is we both know James Gross, who also studies emotion regulation at Stanford, mm-hmm. And sometimes when it's really bad, I just email him and ask him what to do. And I'm a big believer actually in, the science of all these things that we're trying to do. So sometimes I cheat and I just email James Gross.
It helps.
It does.
Maybe it might be writing the email itself that is a strategy.
I actually think just voicing, I mean, as you said, again, like you're my tutor on this stuff, but just saying, just when you asked me, how are you feeling? And I'm like, I'm feeling irritable. Just actually saying that, I'm like a little less irritable. It feels good to be, heard and seen, and sometimes even by yourself.
Cool. So let's jump into the content because I know people are dying to know what's going on in your brain and what you've published and what you've found in your research. So, you're most well known for your work on grit. And so I think firstly, that concept, for a lot of people, it gets muddy. Like people think of it as one thing. And then I say, well, have you read the book? Have you read the articles? Because it's not the way Angela talks about it, but it's the way the people in the populace talks about it. The same thing applies to emotional intelligence, right? People.
I was going to say, you must have the same experience because it's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And all.
Yeah. I was giving this talk on Wall Street actually a while ago, and some guy goes, I know what emotional intelligence is. I'm like, okay, cool. What is it? And he goes, it's charisma. I'm like, well, that's in our definition, but anyhow. So can you tell us what is grit?
Yeah, I'll tell you how I use the word grit because just like your example, it's not like I have a patent on like the English language. So I'll just tell you how I use the word grit, which is to suggest stamina about your goals. And really, this has two dimensions. Like one is having the tendency to set goals and stick with them, as opposed to switching a lot, right? So Mark, you and I said we knew each other. I guess have known each other for at least a decade. You were a psychologist then. I'm a psychologist then. We're still psychologists. You and I converged in really wanting, especially to help kids. Like that hasn't changed. So this kind of sustained passion for goals is one half of grit, and then also working really hard at them. So sustaining effort. So not just commitment to goals, but effort. So not just passion, but perseverance for long-term goals. That's how I use the word grit. I'm guessing that a lot of people are using it, in related ways, but like, more like toughness or like, which is not exactly how I use it. Like I said, it's helpful for me to say what I mean. I don't mean to say other people are wrong. I'm just clarifying what I mean when I say the word grit.
Mm-hmm. And then of course somebody's saying it's like conscientiousness, right? And so you've done that research, and how would you parse out like the conscientiousness part of grit?
And I know a lot of the people who are joining us today are like super sophisticated when it comes to psychological research, but others may be coming from different backgrounds. So just for level setting, conscientiousness refers to this whole family of personality that includes being orderly and punctual, responsible, hardworking, like grit. So it, in my view, includes grit, but is a whole like continent of characteristics that are not exactly the same as grit. So it is a big family. And in my research, it's more or less what I find, which is that they're very correlated. So people who are punctual and dependable and neat and self-controlled are also gritty. So there's a family there, and grit belong to that family. And I think that conscientiousness is like a really good predictor of like doing your homework and basically doing a lot of things like showing up to a meeting on time, et cetera, that are, maybe like not the most enjoyable or fun thing, but you do it and it's important to you. So that's where conscience is super predictive, like kids doing their homework, et cetera, people doing their taxes, flossing your teeth. I think grit, I've always been interested in as a predictor of very high achievement, like accomplishing something is really important to you in life. To me is more about grit. And in my research, for example, at West Point, I find that grit is a better predictor of, making it through the hardest part of training, and better than like conscientiousness. But conscientiousness is a better predictor of things like your, report card grades, for which many students don't have like a whole lot of intrinsic passion,
right,
which we can also talk about.
Yes, cool. And so, as we've talked about this before, and I still, we get stuck in this in terms of like, what kind of construct is grit, right? Because we talk about emotional intelligence as a skill or a mental ability. Other people talk about emotional intelligence as a trait, which I still don't understand how people could think of it as a trait. It's just, unless you have trait as a larger concept, but
I was gonna say, it depends on how you use the word trait, yes. Right? Like, I don't want to get one of these like, I don't want the comments to start saying like, this is why academic, like,
exactly.
Scholarship is totally like on a different planet, because academics can get into long conversations about words. But the way I think about it, so first I should say, I think it is malleable. I mean, I think that's one thing that you and I would both say about our respective fields, is that what we're interested in are things that people can learn and practice and develop and read books about and get better at. You know, like I hope if you come back to me in 10 years, Mark, and you say, how am I feeling? You know, whether I'm irritable that day or not, I hope that 10 years from now I will have better strategies and be more fluent at practicing them. Likewise with grit, I do think you can develop grit. That doesn't, you know, so anyway, traits, like a lot of people hear that word and they think of what you can't change.
Right.
I think most personality scientists actually use the term to mean like things that are relatively stable, but you can certainly change. So again, language. So anyway, I think of grit as a tendency that can change over time and with, you know, experiences, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, later I want to talk to you about the intersection of grit and emotional intelligence in a little while. But before we go there, I'd love, so your primary kind of predictions or research shows that it's more supportive of long-term outcomes. Is that what you're trying to?
Yeah,
so
more like meaningful
dreams?
Long-term, right? Long-term, like, you know, the marshmallow test, you know, the famous marshmallow test, which we can also talk about, is really literally it takes place over minutes. You know, like, can I delay gratification for how many seconds or minutes? You know, grit is really about like years. I mean, in my questionnaire, it's like having the same, you know, set of goals for years, like working hard for years. Like, so it's a long term, but I do also think it's really important about personally meaningful, right? Like, I feel like I'm fairly gritty, but I'm not gritty about everything. You know, You could say, how come you're not really gritty about like your exercise goals? And I'm like, because I don't really care that much about my exercise goals. So it has to be personally meaningful, and long term.
So what I'm hearing you say is that to help people develop grit, we have to help them in many ways find the things that they're passionate about, like help them discover those passions. And then inevitably, like I can, you know, both of us in our careers, like people have criticized our work. I've had superintendents tell me things like, you know, my job is not to teach kids about their feelings. And I'm like, okay. And then I could just crumble. I can walk out of there and just start crying, right? And just say like, all right, it's over. Or I'm like, all right, I'm going to do the study to prove this guy wrong. Or I'm going to prove her, you know, that, you know, whatever. So like, it's like this combination of like passion and some kind of strategy. So I'm curious to know like more about that.
Yeah, you know, again, like what does grit sound like? Grit sounds like, you know, like, you know, just like get your fist into balls and just like keep working. But a lot of it is flexibility, because if you think about pursuing something over years, right? I mean, think of it like Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. I am sure there were 1,000 barriers, that obstacles, whatever, bureaucracy, fundraising, staffing, like anything worthwhile has so much complexity and so many like, you know, built-in kind of like failures and setbacks. And it's not always like ball your, you know, fists and just like it's very often like, this isn't working. How else could I do that? Right? So I don't want to say that you know, grit is every possible good thing, but I do think that having flexibility in how you're achieving those long-term goals, like almost has to be the case, or it is really important. I think you may be aware of last month there was just a great paper. It was not my paper, so I'll just praise it to the heavens, by Patricia Chen and also Carol Dweck at Stanford. Patricia's at NUS in Singapore, and it was about strategic mindset, about the you know, importance of having flexibility when you're pursuing a goal. And one of their studies was they had people cracking eggs, like, you know, and separating the whites from the yolks, which is, you know, something that some people know how to do, and a lot of people were like, how do you do that? And in one condition, the people in this experiment were just like prompted to ask themselves, like, how else could I do this? Is there an easier way? Is there, you know, and that actually like got them to, like, over the course of the experiment, like, to do it better. So I do think that when we think about goal pursuit, don't only think about like working harder, like staying up later, waking up earlier, but also being flexible. Like,
well, and creative too, maybe. There's creativity there too. I think, if you're not, it's like, I think it's interesting because now you're making me think about like my own determination, and when I get like negative feedback, I tend to say, all right, let me step back. Let me evaluate what they said. Is there some truth to it? Do I need to sift it out? Is it based on their perspective? Are they just whack jobs? And then I have to play with it and be like, all right, so here's a barrier. I got to fix that. And in many ways, Ruler as an approach, it started with my uncle and me working with middle schools because that's where I suffered and where he was a teacher. And then we just failed because not everybody was my Uncle Marvin. And then the teachers were barriers in many places, now less so. Then the leaders were barriers, and then the system was a barrier. And it was like, what do we need to do to convince the system to take how this kid feels seriously? Because the direct instruction was actually that was the easiest to do.
Yeah. I mean, if there is a group of people on the planet who are selected for creativity and ingenuity, it's teachers, right? Educators. It's like, that didn't work.
Right.
There's this constant. So yeah, but I couldn't agree more. And I'll just confession, for me, it's not always easy. I am a little bit of a, I'll just work harder type person. And I have to remind myself, how can I work smarter? How can I, because so often it's not just that you have to push harder. I think so often is that you have to, like you said, take a step back and maybe you have to take a step to the right. You have to maneuver a little bit.
And also recognize that you need, our center now has 60 people, and my goodness, the Gestalt principle, right? Is there. It's just, it makes a difference. Love other. Come on, everybody! I've been doing this 25 years. It's time for your opinions and your ideas, and it makes a difference. It makes it better.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
All right, so now I have a question about people who may feel like they just don't have the grit, or that they feel a lack of motivation. I've met a lot of very creative people in my life. As you know, my partner is a filmmaker, an artist.
I just heard many stories about him.
Yeah, very creative. He actually created a documentary. We did a documentary on trans youth that we showed yesterday that was really well received. It was just talking about grit for these children who have to persevere when their identity doesn't match the identity that everybody else wants them to have. And then also the environmental supports that they need. That's a whole nother conversation.
Which are so wrong.
But what do you feel is how do you help someone who just has all the passion piece, but they don't have the they get in their own way, and this, I think this happens in a lot, and artists are not, sometimes they're built to be creative, and you see people who are just, they're amazing artists, but they don't know how to get their art out there, and they don't know how to do the second piece, that makes them
right. It's I have the passion. So I think it's more common. So if you think of these two pieces, right, you could have neither. You could be I need help on both passion and perseverance, but you could have one and not the other. I think it's actually more common to be I'm resilient, I'm hardworking, I have lots of strategies for pursuing goals, but I'm kind of not clear on what my passion would be. I actually think that's more common. So we could talk about that, but I do agree entirely that you could have passion, but not get any traction. And in fact, you could have a passion that you've had for years and not be making progress. In this theory of goal pursuit that is called sometimes the Rubicon model. It's folks that Peter Gollwitzer, Gabriella Ettingen. The idea is that the Rubicon was the river that Caesar, basically having set his army into, it was kind of like a declaration of war, and then it was the point of no return, right? You couldn't go back. And their idea is that when you've committed to a goal, that is in some ways a kind of not exactly one-way street, but there's something of it. But what comes next? And I think that's where a lot of people sort of stumble. There's two phases in this Rubicon model that come next. The first one is planning, and then there's action.
Mm-hmm.
And planning is basically something that Gabrielle Ingen and Peter Golitzer find that people know how to do. Like everybody knows how to make a plan. Even young kids know how to make a plan. Even at age 3 or 4, kids know how to make a plan, and that's like an intention to do something in the future. But we don't always do it. So we can all make plans, but so many of us are like, yeah, I really, really want to study for the GREs to get into graduate school. Definitely want to go to graduate school, but they never make a plan. And to make a plan means to schedule when that action will be. Like, when are you going to do that? What specifically are you going to do? So just one of the things I would say is that in these two stages that have to come after you've committed to a passion, the first one is planning. And I do think you know how to make a plan. You've made plans before, but maybe like so many of us, you don't do it. So you have to kind of maybe remind yourself that every goal is just a wish until it has a plan to go with it.
And then also you talk about the barriers piece, like identifying those barriers, which I think I've actually incorporated into my work, because I find a lot of people set goals to be healthier. They set goals to be their best selves with their kids, but yet they wake up in the morning, they're irritable because they haven't got enough sleep, and they're nasty. And they say, but it's not, I can't be my best self. And I'm like, all right, let's take a step back, and it's, you're not getting enough sleep. So it's going to be hard to be your best self, right, if you're depleted.
When I saw you last, working with educators, doing a workshop, and I really loved that you incorporated this technique that, again, Gabrielle Ingen in particular, but also her husband Peter Golitzer developed. We talked about goal setting, right, and crossing the Rubicon, and then we talked about the importance of making plans. One of the strategies that they have worked on for years, it's really a beautiful strategy, is that you identify the obstacle, and the language that they use is like the obstacle that stands in the way, which is a really wonderful visual. Like, what is the obstacle that stands in the way of you achieving this goal? And I think you're exactly right to say that, like, so oftentimes, like, people also skip that. It's like just asking yourself, like, what is the obstacle between me and like a more, calm, pleasant mood? And to be totally honest, if I think about like even my morning, and like I was a little irritable to my husband, like what was the obstacle? Actually, it would take me a few minutes. It's not like immediately obvious, Mark.
Exactly.
I'd have to think about it. I'd be like, okay, maybe it is lack of sleep, or maybe I'm stressed about other things.
Exactly, because it could be something almost subconscious that you're still processing from the day before. Yeah,
exactly.
So as you know well, like I said earlier, each of us and many of us in the field get criticized, or people misunderstand the concepts. So I have two questions about, the notion, that grit is used to help children who are underserved, like that, pushing underserved kids or minority kids to be like the majority. And I'm just curious, how do you respond to that? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, there are, prominent academics whom I respect a lot, like Bettina Love, who have not just suggested, more or less said that, the notion of grit and how it's being applied is actually racist. And the argument that's made is that, it's disproportionately talked about in schools for Black and brown students. I have to say that, and she's not the only one, Pedro Noguera, really amazing, thoughtful people. When I first heard that, I was like, what? Like, it just didn't occur to me. I don't know that, I can't know like all the schools and like which schools are really actually talking more about grit and not. I would really hope that it's not about that. And I do get lots of email, like I've given talks on grit by invitation to Andover and all the schools that are like Andover, right? Like not all the schools, but I'm saying like my inbox is flooded with, requests for information that are not from, the kinds of schools that are just, about a certain demographic. It's kind of almost the whole rainbow of schools. So I was a little bit like, what? But like anything, and again, like you're my tutor here, Mark, like to listen, right? It's like, what is being said? And if I really listen and not get like entirely defensive, then I have to say, like, they must be seeing something that I just don't see. And I would just want to stand up with them and say, like, it is incorrect, wrong, and racist to talk about any subgroup of kid, of any, particular demographic, and say like, oh, these kids are in deficit, like, and they need, a lecturing too. And there's another point that they're making that I think again I need to stand up and amplify as opposed to, squelch. And that is that I think it is true that when you see some kid who does go to Andover and is like 4 years on the crew team, like you can point to that like extracurricular record and you can be like, oh, that's obviously grit. But what about a kid who has these invisible burdens that they've been shouldering? Like, where do you put on your resume that you had to take care of your little brother and little sister and make dinner every night? Like for years, like where do you put that on your CV? I know where to put varsity crew captain. I don't know where to put that. And I think that's a really important point. So I'm, really trying to, like understand more that perspective. But I will say that, when I said I study effort and motivation, it is not because I think like a subgroup of people needs to understand that better. I think we all are more the same than we are different. And the kind of idea that, motivation and effort are important is truly universal. And I think if there's criticism about how it's, directed disproportionately, then that criticism, needs to be amplified.
I appreciate that. And I think, I think a lot of these concepts in social and emotional learning can be implemented in not the ways that the developers intended.
Right.
I remember when I was working, I won't mention the charter school network, but they were like, well, we don't want to talk about feelings and history. We don't want to integrate it. We just want you to teach these kids self-control. And I'm like, that's not like...
So they can get better test scores or something.
Exactly. And so I gracefully got out of working in that network because I just realized it was not going to be the right direction. And so I guess my question goes to the conditions. That no construct exists without context.
Yeah.
Right? Everything's a context. Like, the culture and climate of a place like Yale or University of Pennsylvania where you teach is different than the culture and climate of, where I grew up, for sure.
Yeah.
Nobody read Shakespeare to me growing up, Yeah.
Cherry Hill, New Jersey too, by the way.
Yeah. So what do you think about context? How does context interact with grit?
And by the way, that is another criticism, which again, I think has to be like amplified, not muffled, which is that when you talk about emotional intelligence or grit, or like it could sound like, well, if these kids had these things, then context wouldn't matter. And it's like literally the opposite, right? If you care about emotional intelligence or grit or curiosity or, the list goes on, kindness, et cetera, you would care more about context, not less, for two reasons. One is the expression of these, strengths or skills, et cetera, like depends on context, right? Like I was once more than once actually, in a underserved classroom in an underserved district, I should say, and it wouldn't matter how gritty you were. Like I spent a whole day and nothing was taught. I was like, what would a gritty kid do in this classroom? There's no opportunity to learn. No lesson plans, not enough laptops in the laptop cart, like no learning opportunities, no challenges in which to show your grit. So that's one way in which context matters enormously. You have to have the conditions to even allow you to express, skills and mindsets that you have. Second way, even more so, and if policymakers are listening, which I hope at some point they do, that if you really believe in social emotional learning or character, use the term you want. I use those interchangeably. I know not everyone does, but you would invest more in context, because like it's not only that you need context to allow you to express these things that you've developed, but you need context in order to develop them. Like, where do these skill sets and mindsets come from? And I know we agree on one thing, which is like human beings, just we are not like horses and frogs that like, they hatch or they're born and they're kind of like, development is very automatic and it's great. Human beings need years and years of investment. So we need great schools and we need coaches and, rabbis and uncles and aunts and parents to create contexts and conditions where kids can develop these adaptive mindsets and skill sets.
Well, what you're making me think about is that, right, ultimately, the way I see grit as well is that the job of the educator is to help children find their passion. I don't think it's like to teach. I think this purpose passion thing gets confusing. I think purpose is like a whole thing that takes time, right? But, if you can help a kid or create the context for children to find their passion, and then you give them the strategies and skills to help them pursue that, right? That just seems like.
Well, you asked me like what's on my mind right now, so can I share thinking, which is 3 hours old? I was like, I'm talking to Mark, and but like I was also like looking at my own data for on grit, and so okay, just like it's fresh, so it's I'll be a little more articulate at some point later. But when you're a kid, your passion is probably like an interest, right? I think of a fully developed, mature adult passion as actually having two parts, like things that you're interested in, like they're enjoyable, it's fun. For me, like psychology is so interesting. Also cooking and food are really interesting, right? The other half of passion in maturity is your values, right? And I think that's what most people think of when they think of purpose and meaning, right? But when you're a kid, when you're like 10 or 15 or 18 or 20, like you are really probably more at the stage in life where passions take the form of things that you're interested in and they're enjoyable. They don't always have to have kind of like this noble purpose that like integrates to your values and like your mission in life, et cetera. And I think that's a really important thing to just note developmentally, that like we shouldn't be asking fifth graders to be making like a commitment, like you said, like to like a lifelong, years-long purpose. And the second thing developmentally that I would like to emphasize that I think all developmental psychologists would more or less think is common sense, is that childhood is a time of exploration. So it is true that in adulthood, when you look at like, a great performer, right? Like that they have spent years and years devoted to a craft. But childhood is about experimenting and exploration. And like, it's fine to do something for a day and like be totally into it. And then the next day not want to do it anymore. And that's part of the sampling. So paradoxically, somebody who studies, sticking with things for years and years is recommending that young people be given the freedom and the opportunity to try things, drop them, and the more the merrier, honestly. And then at some point, if you're still doing that and you're 65 years old, then I would say, well, the clock doesn't run forever. And maybe, if you do want to get deeper into something, you might consider that.
Right. I mean, I've seen that people who have tremendous grit, in the one side of it, the perseverance piece, but they're not really sure where they're going, and I've seen it also the negative side. And this is another dark side that I'd love for you to just chat about for a minute, which is grit without self-awareness, which is something I've experienced as a professor a lot. It's like, I'm going to get I'm going to email this professor until I get that A- switch to an A. And I'm like, your grit is like going to make me really dislike you. So is that grit, or is it something else, or is it grit lacking self-awareness? Like, what's going on there?
I think self-awareness is important. Like, again, like I don't want grit to absorb like all positive characteristics. Like I don't want to be like, oh yeah, grit is also self-awareness.
Right, exactly.
So, because it's not. Like I actually don't think that grit is the only thing you need, or even the most important thing you need. So self-awareness, I do think is distinct, right? Like really knowing yourself. I will say that when you ask the question, is grit enough? I mean, certain world leaders like are obviously really gritty. Like nothing will stop them. Like they're just going and they're very committed to their goals, etc. But you really wish desperately that they had, among other things, self-awareness and empathy and humility and some, other lovely characteristics that make people, I think, good people, not just great people. Self-awareness, I think, for grit, like most relevantly, is to ask yourself, like, is this really what I want? Like when I reflect on my values and my interests, like, is this really where my energy is best directed? I do think that self-awareness is a great bedfellow for grit because it to me, I'd rather, people in power not have grit if they don't have self-awareness, because at least then they would just be ineffectual, right? Yep. But grit without a moral compass, grit without self-awareness, grit without compassion is tremendously dangerous.
I couldn't agree more. I appreciate you saying that. Oh, so much to do.
I know.
And people say
Michelle Obama did you hear this? Michelle Obama on her podcast said that she was like, I have to own that, like, I'm, suffering from some kind of mild depression. And I was like, girl, yes. I mean, anyway, there's so much to do. And there's a lot to do. It's a hard time.
It is. So I've said this when I did the presentation for your organization a couple of weeks ago. I have a vision. I will sleep well at night. I will feel like I can retire when, there is this thing that I'm calling an emotion revolution. That these concepts are not something that we have to push for any longer. They're just they're infused into the immune system, of our nation's schools and workplaces and homes and communities. So can I ask you, in our last few minutes together, what do you think is needed to create this revolution in terms of social and emotional skills being central?
I think it's happening, maybe not quite at the pace that, you and I would like to see. But if I just think back to my own childhood, I grew up with a brother and a sister, so there were three of us. And I would just say we probably all needed therapy, like separately and together as a family, like. And I remember once one doctor had recommended that, like, our family go to therapy and go to see a psychologist or something. Back in those days, I couldn't even have told you the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And the times were, and my parents certainly were like, no way, I'll bleep out the expletives, especially my dad. And I think if I think, like, okay, that was like 1980. Right? Now we're in 2020. I mean, in those 40 years, there's been an enormous cultural shift toward understanding that, like, emotions matter. We all benefit from, like, talking about them, sharing them, being vulnerable, and also getting help with them through therapy and counseling and coaching. So I think we're in the midst of a revolution. What can we do to catalyze it? I mean, honestly, I'm so glad you're doing, like, literally this, right? Like, all the people who made time for this, like, to me, these are the small little, these are the battles in the revolution, and it's this that I think will catalyze this to happen even faster.
Awesome, thank you. So my last, what I want to say to you is that yes, you're the queen, the princess, the guru of grit, but also I just want to thank you for your generosity. With time to do this with me and with our group, your generosity for even reading my book and commenting on it. Your generosity.
I loved your book. I loved your book. It's great.
I love your work too. So maybe we can take that last breath, not the last breath, but just like that nice little inhale, exhale. Everybody, we can all take a nice little short inhale and exhale.
And you don't have to pretend to smoke a cigarette while you're doing it. You just do it. Exactly. You can do it. You can I just mime it. I don't know. Then I don't even have to get a pen in my mouth. But I'm working on just doing it.
Awesome. And so you get the last word. This is, what would you like to tell the 1,000 people that are listening to you about, about grit, about anything?
Um, okay, one thing that I have found helpful is the following. When I do get criticized, as you do, Mark, then, there's a small part of me, and then there's a big part of me, or there's a low part of me and a high part of me. And I always remember, Michelle Obama said, when they go low, I go high. And I think it was helpful to me. I was like, wait, what would the head of character lab do? Probably not be mean-spirited, defensive, and closed-minded. So if it's helpful to others to think we all have, different parts of ourselves, and then maybe you have your own Michelle Obama who reminds you, of your best self and or your better self, and hashtag work in progress. But anyway, that's been helpful to me to remind myself that, I'm trying.
I love that. It's funny because as part of Ruler, we have this tool we call the meta moment. And that meta moment is to help build that space, as Viktor Frankl would say, between that trigger and response. And in that middle is that best self. And I'm always, when I'm visiting classrooms, oftentimes kids think of me, the mood meter man is here. And so, when I'm activated, I'm just like, Mark, you're the freaking mood meter man. Just and it really does help.
Man, handle this.
Exactly. So
yeah, well, we're on the show together. The Grit Guru plus Mood Meter Man, double feature.
Awesome. I'm ready to go. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Great rest of the summer. Good luck with your move. And
thank you.
And totally grateful for you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Wait a minute.
What?
There's a really cool function on this thing called a group fee. All right, I'm using it. Done.
I get it. That is amazing. I think I did it. Okay, good. Great. Do I get a copy of it?
It's going to get emailed to you as a JPEG. And then we can
what? The world is a good place.
We can Instagram each other.
Excellent. My eyes aren't even closed in my selfie, so woo, it's going to be a great day.
Angela, right, Mark, really appreciate
it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.